Нет ничего лучше, чем охота на человека. Ты ее узнал и полюбил ее, не захочешь познать ничего другого.
In 2009, in the small isolated town of Belinsky, Russia, men began to vanish without a trace. And then, to everyone's horror, their dismembered bodies began to resurface, brutally torn apart, bearing the marks of a vicious and vile attack. The assailant, when finally arrested, is one of the worst I have ever covered. He didn't just kill, he took joy in it. This was his purpose in life. He claimed as many as 17 victims, and the depravity didn't stop at murder. He would eat the hearts of his victims and other organs. He documented every grisly detail in his murder journal. The first entry opened with a chilling quote from Ernest Hemingway. "There's no hunting like the hunting of men. Those who have hunted armed men long enough and liked it never care for anything else thereafter." I'm just gonna warn you now, this is a heavy one. This guy was happiest when he was murdering people. It's a truly dark case. But before we dive in, I want to let you know about my second channel called Grim Tales, where I'm covering true stories that are shocking but not murderous. I think if you find this content interesting, then you should go and see what's over there. Link to the channel is in the comments. And if you find this video interesting, then please drop it a like, as it really helps. Also, you can subscribe to my Instagram here. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse or condone the criminal actions described within. Belinsky, nestled in the Penza region of Russia, was home to around 9,000 people. Life there was bleak. Scarce amenities, meagre wages, rampant poverty and alcoholism seemed woven into the fabric of daily existence. But no one was prepared for what was about to happen. Alexander Bychkov was born in 1988, followed 2 years later by his younger brother, Sergei. From the outside, their lives seemed ordinary, living in a small house with a barn and a backyard full of pets. But behind closed doors, the family's reality was far from idyllic. Their father, Vladimir Bychkov, worked as a combine harvester operator at a local farm, while their mother, Irina, was known in the neighborhood for her alcoholism. Over time, Vladimir also began to drink heavily. The family home was filled with addiction and neglect. As if their lives weren't difficult enough already, tragedy struck the family when Vladimir, at just 40 years old, ended everything. Believed to be driven by the relentless struggles of addiction, the family did have a history of this though, as Vladimir's father died the same way. After Vladimir's death, the household descended even further into chaos. Irina's drinking spiraled further out of control, and the company she kept, young men, attracted by her reckless behaviour, frequently hung around the house. Money was already tight, but now it became so scarce that Irina forced her sons to work long hours as boys. They scavenged through dumps for scrap metal, or dug vegetable gardens for neighbours, from early morning to late at night. And if they returned home without enough money, the punishment was brutal. Bychkov later said during interrogation, and quote, "My mother used to beat me. You've seen old kettles with wires as thick as your finger. If you complained, you got hit more. That only makes you angrier. But it's all a mundane matter. A mother is a mother. I don't blame her. Maybe I should have been beaten more. Some of my actions deserved even harsher punishment." The brothers worked through the harshest conditions, lacking proper tools or clothing for the tasks they were given. The local community couldn't help but notice the gaunt, undernourished appearance and their bruises. It was common knowledge that they were neglected, and the neighbours took pity on them. Even when they were caught stealing, they were let off. Their desperate circumstances well understood by most. In fact, some neighbours offered them food out of sympathy. Although embarrassed, the boys accepted it. They had little choice. In his younger years, Bychkov was calm and quiet, displaying an intelligence beyond his years. He had a love for classic literature, with Ernest Hemingway standing out as one of his favourite authors. But beneath that calm exterior, there was a burning desire to be somebody. The small town of Belinsky felt like a prison to him. He yearned for more, for something greater than the life he saw before him. The problem was, he had no idea how to realise those dreams. His mother was drunk all the time, and there was no real role models for him. As Bychkov grew older, his frustration grew alongside him, constantly working for scraps. Whilst his mother drank away whatever little remained, he began to see himself as better than the bleak existence he was forced to endure. And when his mother attacked him one too many times, something inside him snapped. He fought back. This shift in behaviour didn't sit well with Irina, and soon both Bychkov and his brother Sergei were sent to live with their grandparents. It was around this time that Irina had another son, born from yet another drunken relationship. Like his older siblings, this child too was mostly left to fend for himself. Life at their grandparents' home wasn't much better. Bychkov's anger was bubbling over, and he often turned it on his younger brother, beating him severely on more than one occasion. At college, things didn't improve either. Bychkov stood out. He was different. He earned nicknames like Rambo and Poacher due to his strange behaviours, including eating raw meat and fish in front of his classmates. He would bring this in for lunch, sometimes frozen. His peers gave him the nickname Predator, and this one he embraced fully. He was a big fan of action films, and later he would stick an image of this iconic creature into his grisly murder journal. During this time, Bychkov dreamed of joining the Special Forces, hoping to become a hero, someone both respected and feared. But those ambitions were shattered when he failed to meet the physical requirements. Already struggling with everything in his life, this was yet another blow that deepened his sense of inadequacy. In 2007, there was a glimmer of success. Bychkov graduated as an agricultural machinery engineer, but that brief moment of accomplishment was soon overshadowed when tragedy struck the family again. Sergei, Bychkov's brother, was brutally beaten and thrown from a moving car, an incident rumoured to be over debts. The fall left Sergei with brain damage and permanent disabilities. Bychkov found himself caring for his brother, as their mother remained too drunk to function, and their aging grandparents could do little to help. But this meant that Bychkov could no longer follow his chosen career path. Bychkov found work as a security guard. Not long after he took the position, locals began to notice something disturbing. Cats and dogs were turning up dead, each with a single stab wound under the chin. With so many other problems in town, no one paid attention to the killings, but the truth was far darker than anyone suspected. Bychkov's bloodlust was only just beginning. Bychkov crossed the line into murder on the 17th of September 2009. His first victim was 60-year-old Evgeny Zivkov, a man who had come to the Belinsky district to collect papers for his pension from the local library. He was finalising the start of his retirement. After learning he would need to return the next day, Evgeny decided to stay in the area rather than make the journey home, only to come back again. It was during this unexpected stay that led him to cross paths with Alexander Bychkov. Walking through the park, Evgeny noticed Bychkov sitting alone on the bench, drinking beer. Evgeny spoke to him and ended up joining him. They began drinking together, two strangers finding enjoyment in each other's company. After some time, Bychkov invited Evgeny back to his house. At the time, Bychkov was living alone in his grandmother's house. His grandmother had moved in with other relatives, leaving him to his own devices. They continued drinking, but what started as a casual conversation quickly turned into an argument. Bychkov later told his version of the events that night.
Дал нож, когда он открывали бутылки. Он внимание обратил. Вернул мне нож, я так с ним играл, с ножом. Когда он внимание свое немножко от меня отвернул, не стал на мне зацикливаться, внимание обращать. Тогда я нанес ножом, удар ему под нижнюю челюсть.
In an instant, Baishkov had crossed the line, killing Evgeny in the same way he had killed those animals. He disposed of the remains in a deserted area, leaving the body to the elements. Baishkov would later claim that he hadn't planned to kill that night, but as he stood over his first human victim, exhilaration took hold of him. He enjoyed it so much that he began keeping a diary, documenting his thoughts and emotions about the act. He wrote, "I had courage. Because I killed a man, I was able to do it." Previously, Baishkov had wondered if he could ever step over the line and take a human life. After that, he was certain. He believed it was his calling, convinced that he had every right to kill. A month and a half after murdering Evgeny, Baishkov returned to the scene. To his surprise, the body lay untouched, exactly where he had left it. This time, he dismembered the head and threw it elsewhere in the deserted area. Was it his way to relive the thrill of the murder, or was this simply another step in his descent into darkness? The next victim was much closer to home for Baishkov. It was his mother's boyfriend, Vladimir Berezovsky. Vladimir, not surprisingly, was an alcoholic, and both Irina and himself would often get into arguments when drunk. Vladimir would violently attack Irina and Baishkov's younger sibling during these drunken arguments, but when it happened on the 4th of November 2009, Baishkov was there to witness it and decided to take the matter into his own hands. He told Vladimir to relax and that he needed to take no notice of his mother. Calmly, he offered to walk him home to defuse the situation. He suggested they take the long route, the one that was more secluded, but the quiet path they took would soon become a place of horror. As they were walking, out of sight of anyone else, Baishkov's rage came to the surface. He began to stab Vladimir. His stabbing was so ferocious that Baishkov actually cut his own hand quite severely. He stabbed Vladimir until he died. The bleeding from his own wound would not stop, and he ended up using a rag to stem the flow of blood as he began to dismember Vladimir's body. Baishkov dismembered his head and threw it into some nearby bushes and hid the rest of his body underneath some leaves. It was really a lazy attempt to hide the body, as if he did not care about being caught. The next day, Baishkov had to visit the hospital. The cut was between his thumb and index finger. It was caused by holding the blade and stabbing at the same time. With Vladimir being reported missing, and this young man coming into the hospital with a suspicious wound, the authorities were informed, but he simply told them that he had fell in the park onto a shard of glass. The authorities were unaware of the connection between the missing man and Baishkov's mother. They accepted his explanation without further investigation. This moment was a pivotal point in the case. The killings were escalating, and this could have been the opportunity to stop Baishkov before his killing spree grew worse. In that brief window, the chance to prevent future horrors was lost. Irina asked Baishkov what happened to Vladimir, but he played dumb and told her that he had no idea. He said that he walked Vladimir home, but after that, he doesn't know what happened to him. To maintain this facade of concern, Baishkov even joined the search efforts, playing the part of a worried friend. Vladimir was known around town for his drunken antics and aggressive behaviour, traits that earned him no shortage of enemies. Baishkov's involvement went unnoticed. It seemed plausible to everyone that given Vladimir's history, any number of people might have had a reason to harm him. The skull of Vladimir's body was found a month later, but the rest of him was never recovered. The next attack was a gruesome double murder on the 8th of May 2010. Lev Andreev, 47, and Alexei Kutuzov, 37, were enjoying drinks together in the park. Kutuzov, though he lived in Moscow, often visited his parents in Belinsky and was friends with Andreev. That day, Baishkov had joined them. As they laughed and drank, Baishkov was plotting their murder in his head. Then, without warning, he turned on his new friends.
Я вынул нож из рукава, нанес Леве Я стоял, он сидел. Я нанес ему удар ножом под нижнюю челюсть, снизу вверх. Поэтому держал нож обеими руками. Сразу же вытащил нож. Он только успел сказать «а». И начал хайпеть и сидел. Тут и Леша зашевелился, что-то почуял. Я, недолго думая, прыгнул на него сверху. Поезжал к земле. И в итоге все-таки я его победил, нажав правой рукой локтем на гортань.
But the horror didn't end there. He then decapitated them, taking their heads with him as a trophy. Their bodies were left behind, still seated on the bench in a very sinister display. Harrowing. A similar fate awaited his next victim, 54-year-old Evgeny Marishov. He too drank with Baishkov in the park. Unsuspecting of the danger beside him, Baishkov murdered and dismembered him in much the same way, but this time he took the entire body away, leaving nothing behind. There was then a case which caused more of a stir in the community. Arkady Erikalan went missing. His disappearance sent immediate shockwaves through his family and the community. Arkady's daughter raised the alarm almost instantly, knowing that her father was not the type to just leave the city without a word. He was not the usual victim of Baishkov's. Until now, he had picked men who spent most of their time drinking in the park. But this was a family man, someone who was needed and had no reason to just disappear. Arkady had always been deeply connected to his family, especially after the recent hardships they had endured. His wife had passed away from a stroke, and one of his daughters had given birth to a child with cerebral palsy. He was a pillar of support, constantly there for his daughters and grandchildren. His sudden absence was unthinkable. It wasn't like him to disappear without a trace. His family searched for answers, clinging to the hope that maybe there was some logical explanation. Perhaps he had fallen ill and was in hospital, or had an accident. Yet, despite their search, Arkady's name was not on any hospital records, nor did his body turn up in any morgue. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Baishkov would later recount his own chilling version of events during interrogation.
Вот он мне говорит, ты знаешь, мол, кто это убивает? Я говорю, да фиг его знает, говорю, дураков-то хватает. Ну да. Он говорит, я знаю. Я говорю, ну тоже. Он такой прям сходу. 15 тысяч, говорит. И все нормально. А он...
Что 15 тысяч?
Рублей. А он постоянно квасил местный алкаик. Решил, видать, срубить. Я говорю, надо подумать. Ну ты вот подумай. Ну и через несколько минут он там остался.
Arkady found out about Baishkov's murders because he lived in the same area, so he must have seen him with the victims, seen him talking to them in the park. Arkady had asked to talk to Baishkov and demanded 15,000 rubles to stay silent about what he had seen. After the killing, Baishkov wanted to use his skull as an ashtray, but realised he could not keep the skull in his house. So instead, he did something even more macabre. This was an entry written into his murder journal about what he did to the body. I cut his throat, and when he died, I dragged him into the bushes. I cut open his stomach and chest, and then I cut out his heart. Of course I hid the corpse, but I took the heart with me. Then I soaked it, then I cut it and fried it, and ate it with some spicy ketchup and bread. The food turned out to be cool. A few weeks later, behind a busy city centre area, the police made a horrifying discovery. The dismembered remains of Evgeny, Arkady, along with the severed heads of Lev and Alexei. They were found scattered across a 100-metre radius. The scene was chaotic and grotesque. Dismembered limbs and heads thrown carelessly. It told officers that a terrifying scene had occurred. The killer would have been wandering around the area with the body parts, just throwing them around as he walked. The authorities quickly realised that they were dealing with something far from ordinary. The bodies had been crudely hacked apart with a knife, showing no signs of expertise. This wasn't the work of a trained killer, but rather someone acting on impulse. The nature of the crime scene led officers to believe that they were dealing with an individual who was deeply unwell and someone who was not going to stop. As word spread around the locals about the findings of the bodies, they were understandably upset. And it wasn't just the bodies found. There was even more men who had been reported missing, and they feared that they had met the same fate. But at this point, there were no bodies for them. Police were under pressure to find the killer quickly before he could attack again. Alexander Zublov, known as Zulik, quickly became the prime suspect in the brutal murders. His towering, broad-shouldered frame made him an imposing figure. The fact that he had struggled with mental illness since childhood only reinforced the police's belief that they had their man. Zulik was a familiar face in Belinsky, especially around the park and market area. His days were spent wandering the streets, hanging around the market, always on the lookout for part-time work. He'd do anything from carrying shopping bags to helping with odd jobs. But it wasn't just his physical presence that drew attention. It was also his stories. Zulik loved to strike up conversations with strangers, telling grand tales about himself. He claimed to be Superman, boasting of feats as a special forces operative, a fearless paratrooper, and a heroic fireman. In his stories, he is always larger than life, a hero capable of anything. Police received a tip that he had been talking to Lev and Alexei on the day of their murders. It was all the officers needed. They moved in, and it took 6 officers to forcibly arrest Zulik after he resisted arrest, vehemently protesting his innocence. During the scuffle, a penknife fell out of his pocket. This, in the eyes of the police, seemed like damning evidence. It just solidified that they had their man. Given his mental state, Zulik was vulnerable during interrogation. Without a lawyer present, he confessed to the murders of Lev, Alexei, and Evgeny. It was a confession that sealed his fate. He was quickly convicted and sentenced to live in a psychiatric ward, where he was placed on daily medication. Not everyone was convinced. The Ministry of Internal Affairs criticized the swift conviction, suggesting that an innocent man might have been put on trial. But the local officers were resolute. They believed they had caught the killer. Word spread quickly among the townsfolk, and with Zulik behind bars, a sense of relief settled over the community. People believed the streets were safe once more. And for a while, they were. For 8 months, Baishkov kept a low profile, watching as the town went about its life, blissfully unaware of the real threat that lurked among them. He had gotten away with murder, and no one even suspected him. The fragile sense of ease that had returned to the town was quickly shattered as the murders resumed. Vladimir Turasov was the first to disappear after the lull. Known for his reclusive, antisocial lifestyle, his absence didn't immediately raise alarms. It was easy to believe he had simply wandered off, not necessarily fallen victim to foul play. But soon, 2 more men went missing in quick succession. 37-year-old Sergei Lisanin, a janitor who had moved in with his mother following a recent divorce. It was a sweltering summer's day when he left the house, dressed in shorts and t-shirt, intending to quickly cross the road to buy cigarettes at a local corner shop. It should have taken no more than a few minutes, but Lisyanin never returned. He was well liked in the community, known to be a kind person with no enemies. His sudden disappearance could not simply be brushed off. Something was wrong. Then, just 5 weeks later, 34-year-old Sergei Sukharev vanished under eerily similar circumstances. He had placed a kettle on the cooker to boil water and stepped out to the shop whilst he waited. Like Lisyanin, he seemingly vanished into thin air. Baishkov would later confess to these killings and tell the truth behind their disappearances. He lured the men into his house, where he murdered and dismembered them. He admitted to consuming parts of their bodies, eating the heart of Sergei Lisyanin and the bicep of Sergei Sukharev. Their remains were then discarded in a ravine just behind his house. The town, which had briefly believed itself safe, was thrust back into the grip of terror. The realization that the killer had resumed his gruesome spree. This was a chilling wake-up call. Bychkov, growing bolder and taking more pride in his gruesome acts, felt the need to elevate his methods. Simple knives no longer satisfied him. On January 21st, 2012, he broke into a local hardware store, stealing 2 large knives that were designed to cut through flesh and much denser things. He also took drills and 10,000 rubles. The robbery was captured on CCTV, revealing a slight figure as the assailant. The theft of the large knives caught the authorities' attention, and the search for a younger male in the area began. It wasn't long before Alexander Bychkov was arrested for robbery. During questioning, Bychkov admitted to the theft. Police had their suspicions about him being the killer, but lacked any concrete evidence. It was Bychkov's own ego that shifted the course of the investigation. He couldn't bear the thought of being labelled a mere petty criminal. The murders he committed were, in his mind, his life's work. A twisted legacy he believed deserved recognition. This desire for infamy drove him to confess. What's interesting about this desire was that police did not find anything unusual in his house, other than the stolen knives, but he would have been sentenced to just a few months in prison for this, instead of potentially the rest of his life for murder. He struck a deal with the officers: food, tea and cigarettes in exchange for his confession. They agreed, and Bychkov admitted to 9 murders. At first, the authorities were skeptical. After all, others had falsely confessed before, but Bychkov provided details that only the true killer could know. He revealed the location of his murder diary, the remains of 3 of his victims in the ravine. When the police found the evidence, just as he described, they knew they had their man. Bychkov believed this was his moment, the recognition he craved. In prison, he wanted to be seen not as a common criminal, but as someone to be respected, even feared. He told the officers in chilling detail how and where he committed each murder. However, 17 people had vanished in Belinsky, and though Bychkov was adamant that he was only responsible for 9, the authorities suspected otherwise. But Bychkov said that after a few murders he started to enjoy it, and that his favourite number was 11, and his 11th victim must be one of the culprits who harmed his brother. A particularly disturbing aspect of Bychkov's confession was how he got away with his crimes. He claimed to have dismembered people in plain sight, stabbed them to death in broad daylight, and even walked around in bloodied clothes. He carried body parts in bags and took dismembered heads on public transport, and no one stopped him, even going as far back as to his drunken mother, clearly neglecting her kids and forcing them to work for her, or her boyfriend beating her and her sons. He claimed he got away with it because of the locals, who turned a blind eye. He claimed they did not care about one another and allowed someone like him to thrive. After a psychological evaluation, Bychkov was declared sane and fit to stand trial, though he was diagnosed with a personality disorder. On March 22nd, 2013, the man known in the media as the Belinsky Cannibal was sentenced to life imprisonment at a harsh colony in the Vologda region. Bychkov took perverse pride in what he called his morals of killing. He claimed he would never harm women or children because they couldn't defend themselves. He only targeted men, those who could fight back, a twisted rationale that he seemed to think made his actions noble. Soon after Bychkov was confirmed to be the killer, Zulik was released. He gave an interview where he claimed that officers used him as a scapegoat, but he was happy to finally be free again. What an ordeal that poor man must have went through. Today, Bychkov spends his time writing to his wife, an American named Christina Waugh, who has visited him numerous times. She even supports his mother Irina financially. They have a child together, and Christina is attempting to secure American citizenship for him, with the aim of one day getting him released. It's an unsettling end to an already horrific story. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.